Equity and Inclusion Lunch and Learn series that we have at East Tennessee State University. Today we have one of our own professors, Dr. Richard Hawk, who's a professor in the Criminal Justice and Criminology Department at East Tennessee State University. He's also a criminal justice consultant. He spent some time on the faculty at the University of Maryland Global Campus, and also he spent 26 years on the faculty at the University of West Florida. So today he brings a lot of experience that he's going to be talking from the perspective of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the criminal justice system. So Richard, with that being said, take it away.
All right, Dr. Johnson, thank you very much. And welcome to everybody who gets an opportunity to either pop in during the hour that we're chatting today in this Lunch and Learn series, or later if you have an opportunity to download or view our chat later on. And when our office here, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion at East Tennessee State University, chatted with me about doing this topic, I was very excited about it because it is one of those areas within the criminal justice system that is not as well explored or well known, at least by the general public. And so for our university community, for our students, for faculty, staff, and others, it's an important topic and one that always, I think, deserves some look. As Dr. Johnson mentioned, I come to our discussion today with a diverse background of my own in terms of these topics. I started in policing at a very small agency in the late 1970s, but my law enforcement academy instruction was very interesting. It was in Central Florida. The class itself was quite diverse, made up of men, women, racial diversity, ethnic diversity, language diversity, a variety of different things that I like to think formed or certainly did contribute to forming some of my own early views of how things demographically should look within the criminal justice system personnel. Now, with that said, we jump in and look at what we're all trying to do, which is figure out various things about the criminal justice system. Here in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology, one of the overarching things that we're always trying to do for our students, of course, is to help them figure out what is it about the U.S. Criminal justice system that is different or similar to other systems around the world, but also looking specifically at Western democracies and what does that mean in terms of what does the system look like. More specifically today, of course, for our talk, we're looking at the issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and we're going to tease that out a fair amount as we go along here. And just to let you know, we will leave opportunities at the end, either for Dr. Johnson or others here to pose some additional follow-up questions, or for those within the audience who type into the chat box and we can have more of a conversation that way. So diversity, one of the background issues, which I should say is kind of how did I get here? One of the things that I've done since the early 1990s is act as a certified human and cultural diversity trainer for law enforcement and corrections throughout the state of Florida. Florida, of course, being the third most populous state in the United States, certainly one of diversity, and one of the topics that has absolutely demanded and needed attention was started to look at 30 some years ago, at least in Florida. And that was this issue of our differences, our similarities across the society, and the various challenges that can present to criminal justice agencies and to the officers specifically who go out and greet the public and interact with people. And that's key. The kind of training for interpersonal communications, well, that's been around a long time. But this, of course, was more and deeper than that when it actually looked beyond what we might think of as a relatively common communications model of who's the sender, who's the receiver. Do you have a feedback loop so that we're, have an opportunity to clarify what it is? What's the medium? Did we send an email? Did we send a memo? Did we talk on the phone? Could I see you? Were we in a Zoom? Those kinds of things. And now we add in, and of course, we illustrate there can be static and interference that surrounds that communication model. Well, I without question, from all the years that I've had the great opportunity to try to facilitate some of these kinds of discussions, I think the interference, a lot of times, and those who have been with me in different talks know that my particular visualization is always to carry in some psychological baggage, and I usually represent that by carrying in a couple of suitcases, and recognize that that's very often what we all do when we're entering into a conversation. Now, that's whether we, have that with someone we know, we work with, we work for, who works for us, who we're affiliated with in some way. It just changes the types of items that are packed away in those bags, versus often when we are interacting or encountering people who we don't have a baseline on, who we don't know, and they don't know us. What fills the air? Check us again on another day when we talk about implicit bias and some of the other aspects that really deepen the communications conversation. So many years of teaching that in law enforcement and corrections, also creating a couple of courses, one called Race, Gender, Ethnicity, and Crime that I created 10 or 12 years ago, Intersectionality and Police Use of Force, one that I just developed about two and a half years ago, and some other ones. So most of the courses that I either teach or facilitate absolutely involve these topics, because they reflect what I see professionally and personally as tremendously important in our U.S. society. So I left up on the PowerPoint here, as I rambled there, just a little bit about why me, why here, some of the diversity aspects that we think of: race, ethnicity, color, sex, gender identity, sexual identity, socioeconomics, religion, age, abilities, political views. There are many others when we broaden the discussion sometimes to contemplate all the many ways in which all of us are diverse. And that's important, because sometimes we may get lost in one perspective or one issue or another, which is perfectly understandable, and there's nothing wrong with that. But a lot of times it takes a few minutes to kind of talk through and see where are we all starting from, so we can understand what we're referring to. We have a little bit more of a common language. Equity, just once again, kind of pulling out the terms of our topic title this morning or this afternoon: fair and just policies and practices. I could define that different ways. Many of you might. I'm holding it to, when we think about organizations such as criminal justice organizations, interacting as representing an agency, our government, local, state, federal, whatever it may happen to be. That's why I go with policies and practices that are fair and just, as opposed to individual level. Is it connected? Obviously it is, but we know those employees, public employees, are the instrument by which it's demonstrated whether or not we believe there's equity in what we're seeing. And then inclusion, once again, selecting from a incredibly deep, varied, and important bag of terms and concepts. I chose to put up there belonging, respect, and the environment. And environmentally, what I'm referring to is the culture of an organization. So I identify among a couple of things. I'm a forensic criminologist, but with a very deep background in teaching public policy and public administration. I'm also an organizational theorist and have to look at things as a matter of process, as a matter of organization of human beings. Again, as many would attest to, I often speak of the perfect organizational chart, which some of you may have seen somewhere in some place where you've worked or been a part of. But then I always talk about how you take that perfect chart and you smash it down on a group of humans and they go squirting out in different ways and different sides of your chart, just reflecting the reality that we're dealing with humans. And so how well we fit our roles, how well we are able to act within our roles, even if it doesn't always reflect what our inner thoughts are, etc. That's important in teaching human and cultural diversity for some nonprofit organizations, for some criminal justice organizations. We point out, as we could today, that no one's here to get inside your head, see what your thoughts are, and try to change those. We wouldn't want to do that even if we could, because we're also messy as humans inside of our head. But we do have role expectations, and an organization can, should, must set those expectations, and therefore know, for the employees' sake, know what is acceptable, what is unacceptable, and therefore what might need to be corrected, retrained, sanctioned, the variety of things that we go with. And I think, and part of this coming off of last week's great slate of events for our Festival of Ideas here at East Tennessee State University, and the presentations that I was able to go to, a very much the recurring central theme of respect and civil discourse, and that in the charged environments and atmospheres that are more typical of criminal justice, how challenging that can be to both show and act out the respect that we should each have for one another, but the civil discourse, when perhaps think of yourself in some role or another as an employee of the criminal justice system, where you find yourself inserted at the point of social friction often, and whether that limits the choices that each participant in a conversation might have, as opposed to, upon reflection and in the relative calm and of a good civil conversation, to exchange ideas, to be curious, to utilize some of the language of the our Sarah and Beth, the two presenters for Pantsuit Politic last week, et cetera. It was really, some great talks, if you can go back and look at those as well. But again, different models for different times. The criminal justice system, just in the most bare bones way that we could perhaps quickly get everybody on the same page, because for those of us, within criminal justice disciplines and teaching, we often think in terms of police, prosecution, and courts. That's kind of shorthand, but what we often have meant with courts is also corrections. And when we say police, we really mean law enforcement, because that can include deputy sheriffs and state level agents and federal law enforcement who are not technically police, but again, we'd have to have a different course to kind of go into those not just semantical, but important distinctions. So let's just offer you this, that when I talk about the system, we're really looking at law enforcement as, and we'll mention again a couple of times, that's the component of the system. And yes, I put system in quote marks. We'll talk about that. The component of the system that most people are familiar with: prosecutors, who arguably have the most discretion within the system. We think of judges over here on courts as having the most discretion, but when really only 2 to 3% maybe of cases ever make it into a trial setting where the judge may referee, not to cheapen what they do by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a more controlled and a more constrained discretionary system. Does it have implications here today? Sure, you bet, because we know also about disparities as well as what becomes revealed as discriminatory sentencing in the court situation, which then goes to corrections, where those people who the court say you have a sanction of some sort, is it house arrest, is it probation, is it pretrial intervention, and if you do A, B, and C, there will be no record, or must you serve some period of time in either a county jail or a state or federal prison. And then over on the far side of away from law enforcement, I've listed legislatures here. And what normally I then put in the background is the public. So we're going to leave the public silent at the moment as we kind of talk about this, but understand.
Richard, let me take a quick break. Is your slide supposed to be advancing at this point? Are you still on your intro slide?
Okay, let's see. Yeah, on my screen, we've gone to, let's see here. We're on criminal justice system. So let's see if,
And none have advanced at this point.
all right, then what we'll do is we'll put it here. Do we now see a different slide, Keith?
Yes, we do.
Excellent. Okay, so I'll work from it. Thank you very much, because I have 932 slides. No, I don't. So, and we can make, by all means, for anybody who wants this primer, we can make this available through Dr. Johnson's office for anybody who wants to look at it for our thought pieces. This is where you all heard me talking about the different parts of diversity. Now, what you should be seeing, still another slide on figuring it out, but the commentary on equity that I mentioned, and then this idea about inclusion and what partly what I mean in discussing this today. I then move to this, what I just kind of narrated through about the components of the criminal justice system. And the thing that I wanted to mention about legislatures there was pointing out that when we think about, I used a phrase a few minutes ago about law enforcement, for instance, being inserted at the point of social friction. And that's, of course, true in many countries, not just Western democracies, not just the United States. But it's important to think through and understand what policy decisions often led to the appearance of criminal justice personnel at a particular place or issue. Now, as I said, that's a very simplistic one. One of the things that we show students to to teach them, is this illustration here that came from the 1967 President's Commission on law enforcement and criminal justice in the United States. And I only show that to kind of give you a sense of all of the different way stations, if you will, that you see on this chart are places where there may be impacts in the system, both legal and extra legal. Extra legal is not the same as illegal in this context, though it could be, because extra legal might mean some decision maker with some level of discretion within the system may be making a decision based on something other than what is specified by, go back to the legislatures and the Congress, what the legislative branch of the government had utilized. So we kind of get to that point. So now the slide you should see is views of the criminal justice system. And I again mentioned, because it seems to be, not seems to be, it's where typically our thoughts go, and that is to the most visible aspect of the system. What is that? That is the law enforcement component, shorthand, what we refer to as police and policing. And so we're going to talk a little bit about, what, without dragging you through slides full of statistics and numbers, which aren't particularly helpful in this kind of an overview discussion. I want to talk about, what are the demographics within the system, and that surely we think in terms of law enforcement, then we move on and think of some of the other components within the criminal justice system. In law enforcement, historically, there has been a struggle with diversity in terms of the personnel. Now, part of that came from certainly the U.S. history over hundreds of years being mired or historically anchored in slavery and in racial inequality and racism that came with that. And then once again, we had some discussion, some mention last week, and some good talks about the suffragette movement, about women's rights, and recognizing again that diversity and what historical inequities have existed in this country and most other countries stem from a number of areas and a number of historical practices and concepts. So that's really important. And we try to ground students in that reality so that it can't easily be turned aside rhetorically and somebody say, oh, well, all that's behind us. Factually, we know that's not accurate. And so it's important to recognize where things have come from, where we've gotten to, and then hopefully what path we're proceeding along that leads to something good and solid, and that goes back to representing some of those ideas about inclusion that I just very briefly talked about. And interestingly, now I'll share with the audience, too, that my own doctoral dissertation dealt with decision-making, self-efficacy of individuals, largely looking at Hispanics, but also the African-American and women's experiences in joining the criminal justice system. And specifically, what are the things that do act as barriers to making such decisions? So fair to say, I've spent a career pretty much examining, all of these different issues at some length. And one of the things that is paradoxical, it's ironic, not in a really good way, but during the period of time that the criminal justice system was coming more fully into embracing the fact that a good employee is a good employee, period. Man, woman, sexual identity notwithstanding, gender identity, race, ethnicity, first generation, second generation, immigrant in the country based on local employment laws. All of those different things took on, generationally, great acceptance. And here's the thing. It was at that point in time that a lot of, certainly like our students in today's generation here at the university and elsewhere, had more options. Instead of, let's say, in policing, okay, I'm going to start, and since I will be brand new, I will be patrolling on the midnight shift in an area of the community that may not have a lot of activity. I may not be getting a lot of calls to interact with citizens. Or someone could say, and let's say it's in recruitment areas where you want to hire more African Americans, you want to hire more women, you want to hire more Hispanics, more Asian Americans in a variety of places. And all of a sudden, you're having a far more challenging time attracting recruits. We'll certainly want to get to, okay, I can see the logic of that, but aren't there also, within those barriers that you've talked about, aren't there also some barriers that might keep people from wanting to join any of the criminal justice entities because of either lack of accountability, lack of apparent support by different segments of the community? And yes, all of those things bear into that as well. So then I would say, we go here in the next slide, where I've just put, well, perception is reality. And isn't that true for most people? So talking at someone, as we know, if we're just going to talk at them about aspects of why things statistically are okay, or why they're better than what someone might think they are, honestly, I think most people would think at a certain point in their life, they've encountered that many times. That's not usually particularly helpful to have somebody say, don't worry, things aren't as bad as you think they are, even if they're not the ones living your life or have had the experience that you have had, or your family has had, or your peers and your friends have had. So that's really important in any conversation, is it not? We heard some, again, last week in the Festival of Ideas. It was funny for me, echoing many things that I've said in talks over several decades, but one of those is the fact that much listening is merely waiting to interrupt. And so, we hear 4 or 5 times faster than we speak. And so our brain is already formulating some counter to what you may have said. and I didn't hear the next four things you said that may have modified, mediated, or changed the context or sense of what it is you're trying to communicate to me, I'm just waiting for you to take a breath so I can quickly interject my opinion or fact that I want to guard zealously and push forward. So if we think about that, we think about those kinds of issues of communication, we do have to grant and recognize that the perception that each one of us have, influenced in the many ways that it may be, that is our reality. We can push outside of that. We can incorporate other things. Again, that's something we heard in one of the talks last week about take off your jersey. In other words, kind of put your orientation aside if you're in a situation where you can. Again, this does not always comfortably, easily apply in a criminal justice kind of a setting or situation, but certainly it is often good advice to try and be curious about what those others think. Again, that's a nod to the ladies from Pantsuit Politics, Sarah and Beth, and that idea about genuine curiosity is a great place to have a conversation, especially with someone who may have a different viewpoint than you do. Well, with that said, when we contemplate perception, we know that within the community, perception varies. One of the latest Pew Research polls that I had looked at, when you look at questions such as, and this, I have to really point out that in our discussion about diversity, because we're time limited, this anecdote is in regards to African Americans, to Black Americans, and whites, not necessarily or specifically in dealing with all the diversity that we have. And so that's important. I'm causing myself a computer problem here. We'll see if we can make that stop. Good, there we go. And so this particular poll, I think it was from either 2019 or 2020, asked, do you believe that African Americans are dealt with fairly in the criminal justice system? Was paraphrased, but that was the broad question. 81% of blacks said no. 61% of whites said no. And so while both majorities, that's a significant difference. And so for, the takeaway, very brief, quick takeaway there is that, depending on, how you're self-identifying as you contemplate that question specifically about the criminal justice system is obviously going to impact, or should be obvious, I hope, to even just a layperson not, schooled in these matters, that yes, the broad experience of those in our country should absolutely inform how we look at that. Differences as well across other kinds of questions, but let's just summarize that, since I promised you no big lists of statistics and tables and charts, which would slow us down, to just say opinions vary, and that there are good, solid, if you will, reasons for why those views vary. And if we cannot each see from our various personal and professional roles why those opinions vary, then we have to work on that foundational platform to be at a place where we can understand where each other are coming from and what information and data we're looking at, and then contextualize it to what we're working on. That it became for me a good spot to put in something here from the late great Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. It's almost a rule that it's important to put in quotes to somebody. I have affinity for various positions of the late justice, and so I thought that was a good one to put in here as we're talking about moving towards how do we get change. And this next slide, so what are some practical solutions? That's what we all, I think, tune into any webinar, any discussion, is where do we go? What is it that we're going to do? What can we do with things that we see? Now, in the 30 minutes of talking thus far, we didn't have 8 minutes, the first hour of which might have been trying to come to agreement on what some challenges within the criminal justice system are. We start from a base of, well, we're looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion. When we contemplate those things, diversity certainly just jumps right out as, well, where are we demographically, employment wise? And I started to talk about several slides ago where historically the criminal justice system has struggled with the diversity of employees for a variety of different reasons, and that it still struggles. And so what we can tell you is that while nationally there may be some proportionality in overall with all of the employees of the criminal justice system, but there is not a direct proportional numbers, which begs the question about what, does that specifically make a difference and why? Now, one of the things, that's really, really important is from a public standpoint. Now, I have to be cautious there because that risks stereotyping the whole public, right? The same way we always caution students, don't begin any, hopefully, intellectual discussion by a stereotypic kind of broad brush issue. But with that caveat, the idea that you have, let's say from a law enforcement, you have 800,000 law enforcement officers in the country across more than 18,000 separate law enforcement agencies. And so if you have proportional disparity, in other words, different numbers than the general public, in your candidate pool, meaning who is it within the city of such and such or county, how many of what background demographically of individuals do you have, and do your candidates match those proportions? And then, as we said, does that proportion matter? I could easily have put up on that point what Justice Ginsburg said about, when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court? She said 9. And she said that's, startling for some people, but she said nobody ever questioned, that there's always been, 9 men up until, the relatively recent past. So even the context of what do our numbers tell us? Now, with that said, you do not see proportionally the number of Hispanic law enforcement officers, correctional officers, judges, prosecutors, same with African American, same with women. I think, for example, because again, I just had to look at these, for women in law enforcement and women in correctional organizations, women are around 17, 18%, when we know in the US population, there's 51% women. Does that mean that, many, many more women are interested, would like to be in law enforcement or corrections? Are we still looking at barriers? Are we looking at cultural barriers? Because once again, these aren't just organizational barriers, but what is the society as a whole? What impacts does it have? The same way I mentioned about legislatures and whether policies that are set, what impacts do those various different policies have on how things at the ground level, how things actually go in the implementation after a legislature or Congress passes some particular law or another. All right, so again, trying to work relatively quickly through the variety of topics that I'd set out for today's agenda, we can say, without doubt, some work in the area of, or some continued work in trying in various ways to recruit a diverse group of candidates from within each community, right? Because we can't say in the US, because each community is different. And so where you might have a department that is, I think Detroit, maybe 63 or so percent Black officers. That may be more representative within the city of Detroit. San Jose, I think, has more than 60, maybe 70% Hispanic officers. This is unknown to a lot of people, but that again is also more representative of a particular community. That's true in Miami, Florida as well. And so outcomes then becomes a question like, okay, well, if there are some places where there is this shorthand idea that proportional demographics are, if not a solution, are at least a reality because that's your base, that's who you have available, but also because maybe we've tried to hire, more of a representative cadre of officers or employees. Keep in mind, clerk of the circuit court's office, as I mentioned, prosecutor's office, public defender's office, the judiciary. All of these go to the issue we have before us today, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion in the criminal justice system as a whole. And the fact that they're all related, even though many would say it's a criminal justice non-system, we forget that not all of these different components, certainly the different components, don't report to the same legislative group, don't report up to the same hierarchy, don't have the same budgets, don't have the same specific mandates of what they're supposed to do. So it's important to understand the components of criminal justice as a network, and that has to be a great deal of partnering with the community and education of the legislature, et cetera, to achieve the things and come to consensus on the goals that you want to have vis-a-vis, whether it's diversity, equity, inclusion, or anything else. What is it we want law enforcement to do? It jumps us, and Dr. Johnson, hats off to him for organizing a presentation a couple of weeks ago, a panel in regards to specifically looking at the recent killing of Tyree Nichols in Memphis, Tennessee, at the hands of what were then officers who have now all been fired and arrested. But all of the officers were black, and Tyree Nichols was a black man. And so some people perhaps rightfully scratch their head and go, well, wait a minute. If the former, officers who did this atrocious thing, if they were also black, what does that tell us? And a quick just jump into there points out nothing's easy, everything is complex, and that this was likely more reflective of poor training, poor supervision, and a mentality of getting away with something, police authority in that specific location. Does that pervade in other places? Oh, without, any question. Is it all 800,000? Again, no, not no. And it couldn't be, and that would be troubling indeed. But it's, of course, horrible and troubling as it is. So we have to be careful on the issue of, well, what is it we are, looking for? I think certainly as citizens, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, et cetera, recent immigrants, not, et cetera, we're looking for professional folks within the criminal justice system. We're looking for that fairness and justice and equity in court, as we certainly contemplate, as I mentioned, the judiciary. Who are our judges? And does that have an impact on outcomes, right? Because I started to introduce that a few minutes ago, and in a good place where in just a minute, I've timed myself fairly well to wrap and open to a few more questions about, do the outcomes, are they changed as a result of the issues, certainly of diversity? And are the mechanisms in place of accountability and transparency that hopefully would lead us a bit more to, equity? And then what are those barriers, some of which I talked about, and how might the rest of us as community, how might we pitch in to help on issues of inclusion? And so I had just, two more. One was the, okay, where to now, which is I should have changed the slide. That's about sort of where I got to, is posing not entirely rhetorical questions. If I had the immediate, quick, and best answer to all of these, other than offering some, I hope, valuable insights and some ability to talk about this, I probably wouldn't be here today. I'd be on a book tour. But that leads us perhaps to the issue of questions. And I, of course, can continue talking, and that'd be awesome too. But perhaps, Dr. Johnson, if we have any questions that have arisen while I take a sip of coffee.
Richard, thank you for the wonderful presentation. We have a few people in our virtual audience. Pleasantly surprised to see Michael Woodruff here, who I worked with many years ago. So this is an opportunity for you all to ask questions that you might have. Feel free to just chime in.
This and while we're waiting and may have some opportunity, and we do welcome anybody to weigh in here and pose a question. We know this is tough, but we should be encouraged by these conversations. I during the pandemic shutdown, one of the things that I think a lot of us did was probably up our webinar attendance. I was also conducting them, but attending, and I hooked into a really great series of them from the Harvard Kennedy School that I attended, and just tremendous opportunity to have discussions. And I hope this, like those of us here today, are encouraged by that fact that there is a great deal of civil discourse. There is a great deal of discussion around these very weighty issues, and the reality that it's hard to get all the other core tasks of public safety done if you are not addressing really incredibly important things about accountability, transparency, knowing what it is that the public wants, and that, which is dicey, because of course that depends on if you're the neighbor who called in, what you want from your criminal justice entities versus someone else. Don't feel any pressure, everybody. Not like class. I'm not going to cold call. Woodruff, what's your question? Yeah, we're not going to do that. Oh, okay. I can read part of that. I see. So you were in Florida. Yes, I was. What was the rest of the question?
If you stop sharing, Richard, might give you more space on your monitor.
There you go. Yeah, there you go. All right, let's do that. I will stop sharing. Did it stop, I hope?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. Now I just see a huge picture of you, which is great. No, I mean, because we have the same hairstyle. I love
so I'll read this question. It says, so okay. You were in Florida for many years. Do you think your efforts would be received in the current environment?
Yes. And I think, and that's really important, because one of the things that I did, I'm roughly the age of Yoda, 803. I was a law enforcement and corrections academy director at one point, as well as director of corrections for 2 counties in Florida, even though I came up through law enforcement first and ended up being deputy chief at a very large law enforcement agency. I only stopped academy teaching in late December 2021 after moving here to Johnson City. These discussions remain today, and I still do law enforcement and corrections training. These are well received. I had mentioned to Dr. Johnson before we came on the air today that next week, one of the large national police training organizations, I'm actually hosting for them a webinar regarding the killing of Tyree Nichols and where are law enforcement agencies and leadership today. And I will have on there the sheriff of Orange County, Florida, head of one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the country, and some others, and to facilitate this very discussion. I'd mentioned that last year I facilitated a webinar that we had over 6,000 attendees, law enforcement, on implicit bias. And so I appreciate the question, because I think it's important to point out that the sense and the empirical basis for that is that the majority of people aren't just sitting back going, no, I think things are okay. I think, a lot of us, especially those of us who've devoted our career to these issues, think, no, it's not okay. And we all have to keep working really hard to, make things okay. And it might get cliche about our kids and our grandkids, but I have a bunch of both. So I think that's really important. So thank you for the question. Yeah, I think, it's like, well, do you think that, oh, I don't know, a particular, political electee somewhere, would that person agree? Don't know. But I think, where I've put my efforts is in the line level, individuals of, who's actually getting the work done. University curriculum here. Let's see. Wonder about the university curriculum, living here under the current administration, general public doesn't think it's okay. I think is how I might read that, Michael, if I'm reading that right. My university curriculum hasn't changed. I've discussed, these issues. So my overlap, right, in I started teaching college courses as an adjunct while a young police lieutenant, and then eventually around 2003 switched over full time doing this, and then consulting and doing other things on the side. My teaching has not changed any. As Dr. Johnson mentioned, I taught for more than a quarter of a century at the University of West Florida, and created those courses that I mentioned about police use of force and intersectionality, race, gender, ethnicity, and crime. I talk about, aspects of both disparity and discrimination, inequity and justice as a foundation in every course I've ever taught, because I believe in it passionately. There's never been any interference or question about any of that. If that's how I'm taking your question, and if I'm missing it, ask some more.
Let me ask a follow-up question to what Mike is asking.
Sure.
Has this whole concept of critical race theory, do you think it has had an impact on how and what we discuss when we talk about diversity in the criminal justice system?
I'm not sure if it does, because as I said, boots on the ground, giving lectures constantly to students, which are expanded conversations about all these different aspects. No one has ever, in any place I've ever taught, including East Tennessee State University, told me to or not to teach something, discuss something, open lines of communication about any topic, and explore it fully, historically, anthropologically, psychologically, criminologically, sociologically. So, speaking as one professor who, we can think of various other, courses, obviously in the social sciences, this is, more something we would encounter rather than our fine colleagues in physics or chemistry or something along those lines. No, for me, there's been no impact because issues of diversity and in all of its various forms, and certainly race, has been central to my teachings, writings, musings for decades.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, there's another one. So again, about changes, and whether there would be, I mean, I know that's been in process for some time. I know I've read President Nolan's and Provost McCorkle's commentaries on those things, and the freedom that has always existed in the academy for scholars, and I don't anticipate any change as far as that goes, which again, as compared to, criminal justice system, diversity, equity, inclusion, kind of that broad aspect of, well, how do we tie that in? Certainly, I think each law enforcement, each correctional, each judge, there's more than what just goes on in any one state or district within the United States, as far as how do we want to treat one another, and how do we want to treat citizens and immigrants for that matter, because most of us, are at some point back in our genealogical history immigrants, either forced or voluntarily or kicked out of some other country. So that's always an important perspective. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate the questions. This will, just so everybody knows too, this will help me get warmed up. I teach a corrections course in about 25 or so minutes, and I'll be talking about inmates in the prison system in the U.S. And interesting, the microcosm of things that you see within a locked institutional facility about what's the culture, what's demographics, what are the interactions, what are the various aspects of it. And people would be surprised that a lot of it models just on a smaller but more intense pressurized scale, much of the same things that any of us might sit around and talk about in the general community. I'll bet you my coffee's cold.
So one of the questions, would you care to share your PowerPoint presentation?
Absolutely. As brief as it is, I'm happy to. And what I will do is
just get it to me or my office. We'll make sure we make it available to those folks.
There you go.
Right. Any final questions that you all might have? Any itching questions that you have?
That's right.
Things that you might not question that you have, but you didn't want to ask before. Now's a chance to ask.
That's it. That's right. I mean, something. Why? Why this? Why that? Why not this? Again, no pressure. I am a kindly professor. I try not to put anybody on the spot.
All right, seeing none. Chastity, you can close us out with, making folks aware of the assessment tool that they'll get so that we can provide Richard feedback from today. So I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. In the chat, you will see a feedback, and this just allows us to continue to plan for future lunch and learns. Also, please be aware, a lot of the questions came regarding the new laws. We will have a lunch and learn on Tuesday, March 28th with Brian Lapps. He is the general counsel for Tennessee Board of Regents. So this would just be kind of a beginning conversation with Brian Lapps along with Mark Folks. So we hope to see everyone then. Thank you.